Hi, I'm Lisa Veldhuis. Welcome to Quarter Life. It's nice to have you here. We're going to be talking about Acts 2 and the real Acts 2 church. This is sort of the landmark passage that people talk about when they're talking about church life. But when I thought about Acts 2 and this story of the early church, I always kind of thought of it as like first century hippies. Like whatever the first century version of lots of braids and Birkenstocks would be, that was what I pictured this church. Not really anything that I wanted to take all too seriously. I mean, I read it because it was in the Bible, but it just really didn't connect all that well. Then a few years ago, I ended up living on a farm with a family, and we lived in intentional community. And there were two other families nearby, and we all kind of farmed together, and we're in each other's lives and in each other's business, and caring about each other and watching each other's kids and all of these things. And if you want to know more about that, just read my book. But for now, the point is that it taught me a lot, and I'm really, really glad that I did that because it was important in my faith and in my understanding of grace, and it helped me to view this passage, Acts 2, totally differently. So I want to go ahead and read this passage, and then we'll get right into it. So this is Acts 2, 42 through 47. And it says, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings," there's the hippie part, "and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved." So we're going to look at the real Acts 2 church here in three parts. First, there's this picture of a vibrant church. Second, the ugly practicalities that must have been underneath. And then finally, the perfect love that made it possible. So picture, practicalities, and then perfect love. So first of all, the picture. Acts 2 records that this early church congregation had a full life together. I mean, we see it. They were devoted to teaching and fellowship, breaking bread and prayer. They had all things in common. They sold their possessions and belongings and distributed to those who had need. Day by day, they went to the temple together. They broke bread together. They praised God together. I think when we look at this, there's a temptation to view it as sort of unreal, like it doesn't actually happen. Church doesn't really happen like this anymore, and it's kind of odd that it did then, right? But it did. It happened, and it's in the Bible because it connects to us. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves and realize that when we look at a community like this, when we even just reading about it from thousands of years ago, there's something in us that has a deep sense of longing for something like this. I mean, who wouldn't want to be in a group of people so safe and so supporting and so generous? Who wouldn't want to be able to trust that all their needs would be met and cared for? Who wouldn't want to open up their lives to people who are just giving constantly all the time? So for each of us, there's something there that really, really resonates from Acts 2. And I think at a basic level, we just crave this sort of provision that happens in good, healthy Christian community. We can even have this sort of overwhelming response like, yes, this is what I want. There's something here for me. But let's not get too distracted by this great picture of what church can be, because if we read any passage of the Bible, including this one, with any sort of understanding of sin at all, we know that there's more to it. There's more behind the pretty picture. And what I'm talking about is this. When basic community is happening, sin is being revealed over and over and over again. Put any two people together and they're going to sin against each other. If you are married, if you have a roommate, you know this, because the closer in proximity and in intimacy you get, the more quickly that sin comes to a head and is revealed. Human sin, that's what we do. So in relationships, sin is going to happen. We put ourselves first. We take advantage of other people. We undermine. We overreact. We lash out. We let things fester and build up until they explode. Even Christians do this. So keeping that in mind, just this reality that we all have, let's think about this actual church and what it must have been like to be part of it. Verse 44 in Acts 2 notes that this early church had all things in common. Okay, so in real human terms, this means that nothing you have is yours. So the clothes on your back, you would give them up to someone else if they needed them more. Your home, you would give it up if someone else needed it more, or you would invite someone in if they needed it. The money you earned, it was all available to somebody else. You just open up your wallet and spill it out for somebody without even a second thought. Just imagine living like that, this sort of pride that would have to be broken down in order to be so generous, sort of materialism that would have to go away on a regular basis over and over just to keep that happening. And especially think of this, the people who have stuff to give away usually have stuff, many of them have stuff because they like the comfort that stuff brings. They like the security of having enough to get by, or they like the status that comes with having nicer things than somebody else. So in this early church community, these are the people who are being called on to give to others, the people for whom stuff is so important and idolatry for them. They're the ones who are giving it away. That's huge. So we see that. But then in verse 45, we also see that they distributed these things to those who have need. So one clear implication of this is that the needs in this community were known. People shared when they had needs, because you can't meet a need unless you know that it's there, and needs here were being met. So needs were out in the open for all to see. And if you were hiding something, it almost seems like the rest of the community was like digging in your business to just try to find out how they could meet your needs. It was just this constant need meeting happening everywhere. Imagine just the humility and selflessness that had to happen all the time for that to be going on. If you had to admit to someone else that what you were doing wasn't enough to get by, that you didn't have enough, that you needed help or assistance. When was the last time, just think of it this way, when was the last time that you kept a need to yourself rather than admit it to somebody else because maybe you were concerned that you would inconvenience them, or because you were ashamed that you had this need? So that tells you just how difficult it must have been to be part of this community and the sort of self-awareness that they were having to go through. And then, as if all of that weren't enough, they're also doing the basic daily things that any community does. They're sitting across the table from one another, breaking bread. So the first thing that comes to my mind is they're having to listen to each other chew. They're having to stand in line at a buffet. They're having to decide who goes first for things and who gets the last drumstick or whatever it may be. All of these little details that happen when you're in community and you're rubbing elbows with one another, and they're all opportunities to get just supremely annoyed with one another. And this community is dealing with that too. They're going to the temple with one another. So, they're having to wait for the person who's always 20 minutes late. And people like me are standing around getting annoyed and having to forgive and having to get over that. And then they're having to put up with a person like me who's 10 minutes early and inconveniencing people. All of these things, they're just happening. And this church is dealing with them and still exhibiting just such beauty to the world around them. So you have to wonder, how does this happen? How does all of this ugly human nature and sin still produce a product that is beautiful, that centuries later we're still talking about and trying to emulate? Well, the answer comes earlier in our text, because Acts 2, the church passage, is actually just 6 verses in the very end of the chapter, but the preceding 28 verses are a sermon that Peter gives at Pentecost. And the message of that sermon really is the beating heart of this whole community, this early church that we talk about so much. So what does Peter preach about? Well, you could say he preaches about the ugliness of sin and human nature, a little bit of what we've been talking about. He introduces the Israelites to the fact that Jesus Christ is God's Son, the Messiah whom the people of Israel had been waiting for and looking for centuries. So Peter not only informs them that Jesus was in fact this Messiah, but he reminds them not too subtly that they had been so lost and cowardly and cruel as to have this Messiah of theirs, the one they've been waiting for, just brutally executed. But this isn't a guilt trip of a sermon, although there's certainly guilt to be had in it. Peter's sermon is a message about perfect love. That's the perfect love we were talking about. That Christ, though he was innocent of sin, it's just incredible, paid the price for all of our sin and made possible just this unthinkable trade-off, that he would take our guilt and bear it, and in return he'd give us access to innocence that his righteousness had earned and his standing before God. And that message is what made it possible for the church to develop such a captivating community, because they could stand before one another honestly, admitting to one another their sins. Because if you've stood before a holy God and had to acknowledge your sin before a holy God, standing before another sinful person is really a whole lot easier. When you're used to repenting before someone who's perfect, it becomes a lot more bearable to repent to someone who's a sinner like you. So you can see then how they had that element in their community. And they could also give of themselves freely. And they could do that because here they see in Christ the ultimate giving of self. He gave his whole life to the point of death for others out of love. And so that becomes so much easier then to look at your neighbor, even if they're annoying, even if they chew loudly, even if they're late all the time, even if they can't, whatever it may be. You can look at your neighbor and see him or her as someone who's worth sacrificing for, because you know that Christ looked at you and sacrificed for you as well. So here we are, Quarter Life, we're talking about church. How do we get to be a church like that? Well, I think we don't ask that question, first of all. We need to go back and look at what this early church did, and they looked at Christ, and they were just filled with awe and joy and reverence and thankfulness for what he had done for them, to the point that it changed them and changed the way that they interacted with the people around them. And what we see is that they had favor with all the people around them, and God kept adding and adding people to their midst over and over again. And now we have a global church, and it all started there. That was the flashpoint. And it's just about understanding who Christ is and what he's done for us. So if we look to Christ and understand, enjoy that he gave freely, then he can do the work in our heart, and we can start to give of ourselves freely too. And if we can look at Christ and understand that he did everything for us in spite of our sin, then we can look at others too, and not see only the sin when we look at them. So I hope that you're able to join me in looking to the church around us and maybe being a little less prideful, a little less, a little less everything that we tend to be, right? And look to Christ instead and find in him the joy and the freedom to love those around you. Thanks.